Mhm.
All right. Well, welcome. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We are very excited to be partnering with the Lawrence History Center for this event tonight, When the Walls Trembled, the Fall of the Pemberton Mill. And I will let Kathy Demoto, our museum board president for the Public Health Museum, kick us off here. So Kathy.
Okay. Thank you, Ashlyn. And good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. As Ashlyn said, my name is Catherine Demoto, and I'm the president of the board of directors for the Public Health Museum. We are very pleased to partner with the Lawrence History Center in bringing you this lecture on the Pemberton Mills. And this is with much appreciated support from the Mass Cultural Center. I'd just like to use a little time for this opportunity to briefly inform you about the museum, which is located on the grounds of Tewksbury Hospital in Tewksbury. The hospital itself was founded in 1854 and has been in continuous operation since then. The museum, as a nonprofit organization, is located in a historic building on the 900-acre campus and was opened in 1994. The mission of the museum is to celebrate the history and achievements of public health, preserves the past, inspires future practitioners, educates the public, and advances the future of public health through partnerships with academic institutions. We have a diverse collection of historic objects and documents related to public health. And although we did have to close temporarily during the pandemic, we have reopened, and you can sign up for tours on our website, publichealthmuseum.org. During the year, we have educational programs for the public. And in the summer, we have a free program for high school students, which actually was just over, to learn about the many opportunities of a career in public health. So we are very much looking forward to the presentation by Robert Farrant on the fall of the Pemberton Mill. And Ashlyn, we have someone else. Thank you.
Thank you. And as Kathy said, a special thanks to the Mass Cultural Council for supporting this program. So just wanted to give them another shout out here. Robert, I don't see Susan on. Did you want to give a quick overview of the Lawrence History Center?
Sure. The Lawrence History Center has been around for quite a number of years at this point. It got started as what was going to be known as the Immigrant City Archives by a woman named Eartha Dengler, who was working in the city and wanted to capture the history, particularly of the immigrants in Lawrence. It's housed in the complex that was once owned and operated by the Essex Corporation. You can see the slide there, the Essex Company, that was their headquarter building. And so the History Center is on all the floors, and there are a number of other outbuildings that used to be a blacksmith shop and carpentry shop and a whole bunch of other functioning parts of the Essex Corporation that slowly but surely the History Center is expanding into and bringing up to code, if you will, so that the records and the documents can be really well preserved. I've been on the board of the History Center since 2011. And really the treasures of the city in terms of its history, apropos the public history, the Public Health Museum, all the records, a lot of the records in Lawrence from the Lawrence public health offices, records about typhoid epidemics, records about the flu pandemic in the early 20th century. A lot of that documentation is there in the History Center as well. So it's really the go-to place for historians such as myself who do immigration history and labor history, but also for anybody from Lawrence, from the area, who wants to learn more about the city or might have had a relative that grew up in Lawrence and they want to figure out what happened to them, where they went, where they live now. In some cases, sadly, where they might be buried in a cemetery in Lawrence. Not always the coolest thing to think about, but people are interested in that sort of stuff, and that's what you would find at the Lawrence History Center.
Fantastic. I just put a shout out here as well to all of your different social media options here on the website to the Lawrence History Center as well, so folks can stay connected. Awesome. Okay. Well, Before we begin, I want to introduce our lovely speaker for the evening. So Robert Ferrant is on the faculty at the University of Massachusetts Lowell since 1994. He is the Distinguished University Professor of History and the Director of the History Department's graduate program. A board member of the Lawrence History Center, Robert recently published The Great Lawrence Textile Strike of 1912, New Scholarship on the Bread and Roses Strike in 2014, The Big Move, Immigrant Voices from a Mill City in 2011, and then forthcoming books, including Where Are the Workers? Interpreting Labor and Working Class History at Museums and Historic Sites in 2021, that's coming out soon, I suspect, and Lowell, The World and Histories of a New England Mill City, that's supposed to be coming out next year. So lots of fantastic publications. So following this presentation, hopefully we'll pick up a few copies of his books. And we look forward to your presentation tonight. So thank you so much for your time. And I will turn it over to you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll let you go ahead and share yours.
Great. Now the big test. See it?
Not yet.
Okay, let me try. Let's see. I know this worked because we did it yesterday.
No worries.
Let's see. Share screen. Yep. All right, here we go. Now it should be okay.
Yes. It's coming.
Now we're good. All right.
Yes.
The moment of truth.
Absolutely.
You know, I always like when I'm teaching, it's sort of like, okay, is this going to work or not? And do my students really want it to work, or would they just as soon leave?
There you go.
So,
thank you.
So thanks all for being here. Thanks for the invitation to give you this this talk. This is a project that I actually started working on last fall during the pandemic, when a lot of the archives that I would normally want to be doing work in were closed. Fortunately for me, the Lawrence Public Library and the Lawrence History Center were extraordinarily accommodating for me in October, November, and December of last year. Sometimes I was a one-person research team in the library or the History Center in my own little cubby working on this. And so I'm totally appreciative for both institutions, as well as the Massachusetts State Library. The archivists there were really helpful as well. And so just to sort of give you the imagery here, this is the mill that we're talking about. This mill was built in 1852, 1853. It opened in 1853. It was built for about $900,000, which was a quite large sum of money back in the day when it was built. The original owners of the building, who I'll talk about in a couple minutes, ran into financial problems in an economic slump in the mid-1850s that ran until 1857. They sold the building to new owners, gentlemen by the name of George Howe and David Nevins, for $500,000. So they obviously lost a lot of money in the transfer of the mill building. So the building was up roughly from 1853 until January of 1860, when it ended up looking like this. Basically, I mean, it's hard to describe this in any other way, but that it collapsed. It basically fell in upon itself late in the afternoon of January 10th with 700 workers inside. Ultimately, out of the rubble of the building, 98 workers had lost their lives, many of them very young, most of the dead young women. And by young, I'm talking about 12, 13, 14 years old. 302 people injured, some really quite badly, some with broken limbs, some with just sort of minor abrasions and scrapes, depending on the luck of where you were as the building started to fall and whether you could have gotten out or not. At the time of the collapse, which is important for the story, there was not a lot of law that protected workers. And so when this building fell, the employers had very little liability for what happened in terms of trying to determine fault, trying to determine sort of like who might be at risk of potentially being sued or whatever. Massachusetts Supreme Court had ruled in 1842 that workers and employers acted as equals. Well, it was really hard to believe now, but acted as equals when it came to workplace risk. So if you worked in a mill building, you were equally you were supposed to know the risk, and you were as equally responsible as the person who owned the building, who we think of these days as really being much more responsible for health and safety. When the building fell, it was worldwide news. Everybody from all over from Europe, reporters came from all over the United States. They actually had to put extra trains on at North Station to bring people up to Lawrence, because not only were there reporters coming, but gawkers who essentially wanted to see the scene. There was great sport made at the site. People actually tried carrying away artifacts and like empty shoes of workers who might have lost their lives or whatever. It's just sort of this very horrific scene. The scene itself was not really protected. This is from the London Times, and you can see the gravity here of the quote. War may produce parallel scenes of horror, but the annals of peace may be searched in vain for any calamity so appalling as the disaster at Lawrence. Now, it's in doing the research, I found a lot of what I think of as, in a way, somewhat human interest stories, but it also shows, when we think about a catastrophe like this, sort of a public health emergency, or whatever we would think about this as, when the building collapsed, the randomness of it all. So a number of workers, young workers throughout the Mill City of Lawrence were all supposed to start First Communion classes on January 10th, the day the building collapsed. And across the city, other workplaces, other factories had said that those workers who were going to take First Communion classes could leave early. The Pemberton Mills owners, overseers, supervisors decided not to let young workers who were in the building leave to go to their First Communion classes. And a number of those workers, young workers, lost their life when the building collapsed. And it just so happened that St. Mary's Church, where a number of those, they were members of St. Mary's Church. St. Mary's had turned into a morgue for a lot of the folks who had lost their lives, and then several of these young people ended up in the church to wait to be identified by their parents. There was another story of a young girl who, just before the collapse, and again, nobody knows this is going to happen. This is instantaneous when it takes place, had been in a fight with a supervisor, and she threw a bobbin at him in anger, and then she ran out of the mill building and sort of disappeared into the city for several hours. And when the building collapsed, her family thought the worst, that she might have been in the collapse and might have lost her life, because nobody had heard from her, or she hadn't made it home after the catastrophe. And it turned out she was fine, but she was afraid to go home. She didn't know the building had collapsed until much later. So there are a lot of these really fascinating stories. Somebody else got out, and his friends were outside with him, and he had left his new winter coat inside and needed to go back and get that winter coat. Maybe he thought his parents would be mad at him if he showed up home without the coat. Who knows, right? But he basically went back in again and never really made it back out. The Lawrence History Center and the Lawrence Public Library have lots of records of these sorts of stories that I'm describing to you. This letter, which I found the original of this letter from a young woman living in Lawrence who wrote to her sister about the collapse and how upsetting it was for her to know about this, and just struggling to try to understand what she might be able to do. Newspapers, magazines, again, sent people to cover this for several days. These are just a couple of examples of the stories. Usually the initial stories all exaggerated how many people were injured, and they generally tended to exaggerate how many people lost their lives. Not that 98 people is, that's a huge sum of people. It was the largest industrial accident of its kind in the country up until that point. Now, most workers, I think, realized that factory work was dangerous, was an occupation that you could conceivably risk life and limb. Working in one of these factories, they were not guards on machinery. The air was usually loaded with cotton dust fiber if you were working in a cotton mill, and you might get some sort of a respiratory disease from that. That would make it really difficult for you to fight off pneumonia or bronchitis or whatever. I found this poem, which has really got nothing whatsoever to do per se with the mill collapse, but it's an epic poem, 3,000-line poem about life in a factory village, written by this guy, Thomas Mann, who was a factory worker. And I found it in the book. The reference is there if anybody wants to read a 3,000-line poem called Picture of a Factory Village. But he really captures the essence of what it was like being in one of these places. Our life's in danger, exposed to constant harm. And he goes on from there again for 3,000 lines. But it's worth sort of, again, locating this collapse in the way that workers considered and thought about their lives. Now, Lawrence basically gets built in a relatively short period of time. There's not much of any consequence in the area that becomes Lawrence until the 1840s. Massive investments are made. The Essex Company becomes the firm that's going to dig and build the canals, the dams along the river, build the mill buildings. And a lot of the money that builds the city of Lawrence is the same family money that built the city of Lowell. And a lot of it is from really, really wealthy entrepreneurs, people that made their money in shipping and the triangular trade in the 18th century and in the 19th century have a lot of money to invest in the growth of American industry. And so that money really builds the city. And this is a woodcut from the New York Illustrated. And again, it's a juxtaposition, a very idyllic scene, while down below in the actual city is the remains of this particular mill building. Now, in 1852, Charles Storrow, who's the head of the Essex Company, is approached by John Lowell, who's a representative goes to the Essex Company to get a mill built. And they work on an arrangement where this deal gets struck between Lowell and Lowell's representative, a guy by the last name of Putnam. And in this document, the original letter of which is in the Lawrence History Center's collection, they agree to do something they've never done before, not that I've seen in the records that I've looked at. They allow John Lowell and his representative Putnam to build this building free from any need to go through the Essex Company's networks of subcontractors and tradespeople who have built all the other mill buildings in the city. And this is a really special arrangement that gets developed because John Lowell wants this mill to be his own. He really wants to see this as separate from the Essex Company, separate from his wealthy family, the Lowells, who have built lots of the city of Lowell, as well as other mill buildings in Lawrence. This is going to have a lot to do with the story as we work our way forward. And so the building gets built. The building opens, as I said before. It operates under the direction of Lowell and Putnam until 1857. Then it gets sold. And then 3 years after it's been purchased, it collapses. And you begin in the newspapers to start seeing these records, these articles about how the building was never really safe, that people always were fearful, that some people thought the walls were too thin, other people thought there was something wrong with the foundation. Everybody had a theory, everybody had a story. Nobody did anything, and the mill operated for several years, but eventually it collapsed. The Architects and Mechanics Journal, which is a trade publication of the day that thought a lot about how American industry was operating. They were comprised of lots of the sort of first generation in America of inventors, engineers, scientists who were thinking about industry and thinking about machinery and such. They had this article, which I found January 14th, just 4 days after the collapse. where they have listened, they've done interviews in Lawrence, and they've got the story now that this building was really weak when it was built. And they had to actually reframe it with a lot of iron and iron plates and reinforce some of the brickwork because people worried about the building potentially collapsing. But again, nobody did much about it. Vanity Fair magazine, the very first issue on the newsstands of Vanity Fair magazine, volume 1, number 1, January of 1860, carried this long poem. People like to express themselves in long poetry back then. And they basically blame it on this guy by the last name of Bigelow, who's the head engineer for the Essex Corporation. And since this is a building in Lawrence and it's built in Lawrence, the Essex Corporation is tied to the building of the building, even though, again, we've talked about this separate special deal that got set up. And since Bigelow is the head engineer, people leap to the conclusion that it's Bigelow's fault. And he's castigated in poetry and song. You know, examples like this, where they sort of show him as, you know, this awful skeleton guy. Death the builder, here's the builder whose name is Death, a fearful one I ween. He builds the frail walls with a breath and bloods the cement between. And so Bigelow is living with this sort of push that somehow he's at fault. And fairly quickly, within just a week and a half or so of the collapse, the city holds, which is required by law, an inquest, a hearing, if you will, on what happened, to try to get to the bottom of things. And they hold a hearing in City Hall. What you see here is an image of City Hall right after the catastrophe, when a lot of the big rooms in City Hall in Lawrence were turned into a morgue. And people were there, obviously identifying family members, identifying people that might have been injured, try to get them help, whatever it would be. And the hearing, the inquest is going to happen in that very same room. And one of the first witnesses is this guy, Buell Dean, who works in the mill. And he basically says it took about a half a minute. He heard a crackling noise. He looked up and he could see the building falling. In a half a minute, it was down. This is the scene of the inquest. I was hoping upon hope, but never could find like an actual verbatim transcription of the inquest of the witnesses. But there were so many newspapers covering the story that they all had running commentary and direct quotes from witnesses. And when you use a lot of the newspapers, you could kind of like piece together all the testimony. And so I could pretty much figure out what people were saying. And so it turns out that on the day of the collapse, they were moving a bunch of really heavy machinery in the building. And the way that they moved the machinery was they would basically put these, what amount to these really large rubber bands around the machines. And they would use the poles that were holding up the floors as a fulcrum to pull these machines around. Hopefully you can get that image. And so these are huge machines that they're moving, and they're essentially using the poles that are holding the building up as the mechanism, as the lever, as the source of energy to sweep these machines around these pillars. And just before the building collapses, this happened, that they were moving this machinery. And so one of these testimonies is about, you know, sort of moving a 2,500 pound machine from one location to another. And he thought he could hear the building when he was doing it. He thought he could hear the building settling. Another person who was involved in that episode, this guy, Edward Whitney, says, I looked toward the south and saw all the south of me settling. And basically, we'd not ceased moving these machines more than 5 minutes. And again, now the building is basically falling down. So the head engineer, the assistant engineer, Bigelow's assistant, is this guy, Benjamin Coolidge. Coolidge says, and he's quoted in the New York Times, that when the building fell, he thought right away that the pillars, the iron pillars that were holding up the building, were faulty. And you can see in this image, if you look at this really carefully, you can see how thick the walls of the of this column are around the top and how thin the walls are on the bottom. And when they went through the wreckage of the building for purposes of trying to understand what happened, and they pulled all of these pillars, these broken pillars out, they could see a lot of this same repetition of these pillars being made in a strange way. Here's another example of the same thing. And another witness who's the superintendent of the Lawrence machine shop, where usually the pillars would have been made, who looked at the pillars and testified that they were defective. Now, this is a person who's run the Lawrence machine shop and made the pillars, the castings for these pillars that would have held up all these other buildings in Lawrence, none of which fell. But again, because of this deal that Lowell and Putnam had arranged with the Essex Corporation, they went basically to somebody to make these columns outside of Lawrence. They actually went to a foundry in Boston, and that's where the pillars were made. So while all this is happening, while all this testimony is taking place, Charles Bigelow is still being blamed for the failure of the building, and he's still being saddled with the burden of sort of having this on his head, that nearly 100 people lost their lives in a building that he was responsible for building. Now, what never came out in the inquest is the role that this guy John Putnam had. Again, the representative for John Lowell, who was in Lawrence while the building was being built. None of this stuff ever came out. And I figure, I mean, again, sort of my historian's intuition, there's no like smoking gun that says, yes, this is it. That while this was known in Lawrence, and while this was known by a lot of the people who were heading up the inquest, it never came out that this role by these wealthy people from Boston who built the mill could in fact have played a role, that their intervention in this deal they made with Charles Storrow could have had something to do with the collapse of the building. And the documents, again, as they come out with this exchange of letters between Putnam and Bigelow, and then another set of letters I'll bring up on the screen in a minute, it becomes clear that Putnam is very heavy-handed in the way he's pushing to get this mill building built. And we see this in a series of letters and journal entries in the journals of Anna C. Lowell, who's John Lowell's sister. And John Lowell, again, is the major investor in the construction of the mill. And she writes in her diary, in her journal, that Putnam, in fact, superintended the building. And in a later entry, she talks about how Putnam was in charge of supervising the construction of the mill. In fact, not Bigelow. Bigelow was actually up a ways from where this mill was being constructed, working on the building of the Pacific Mill, and had something to do with the construction of the Pemberton, but remains to be seen how much. And so none of that made it into the inquest. None of that made it into the hearing. None of that came out. And in the end, Bigelow bears the weight. In the inquest, Bigelow is blamed for a number of the deaths, and he's the only person who's signaled out. These are great funeral, these are cemetery markers for a couple of the really young Irish workers who worked in the mill and lost their life. And so Bigelow now goes away from Lawrence. He ends up in Fall River, but he now is saddled with the singular blame for what transpired. Now, in the aftermath, in the immediate aftermath of the collapse, this guy Tucker in Boston, who's a member of the Massachusetts legislature, immediately the next day, January 11th, he pushes forward to the Judiciary Committee for consideration the setting up of a committee, a commission in Massachusetts that would oversee and inspect all mill buildings when they were built before they could open, and then periodically inspect those buildings thereafter to make sure there weren't any failures in the buildings that could lead to a catastrophe such as the one that I've just described. And again, maybe like figuring out those pillars were no good before the building collapsed and killed 100 people. So the very next day, this piece of legislation is submitted, and the archivist at the Mass State Library actually found this for me, scanned it and sent it to me. And if you've ever seen a historian dance with joy when they find a document they weren't sure they would find, this was one of the ones, because it's just so cool to see the original handwritten, here's the document of trying to push this forward, and here's more when it's actually translated and transferred into an act. It goes through the House. It's introduced by Tucker, John Tucker. It goes through the House committees, it goes through the House, it gets to the Senate, it sits in the Senate, it never moves at all, and then very, very quietly, it just disappears from view in April of 1860. So we go from everybody being worked up about what happened, upset about what happened, loss of life, injuries, and whatnot, and is there a way we can try to figure out how to make this not happen again, to essentially it dying this very, very quiet death. Now, again, I need to do more digging, but my suspicion is wealthy Bostonians who are sitting in the State House, in the Senate, and in the governor's chair and whatnot, probably did their uppermost to make sure this bill never proceeded into the possibility of becoming law. For a while, though, in the wider world, again, to this question of health and safety and sort of worker health and how do we think about workers on the job, there is for a while a debate coming along in the public about trying to figure out a way to create a shorter workday, try to figure out what we do about accidents, about dust, about elevator accidents, which happen all the time during this period of time. And there's really an attempt to try to figure out how to do more of this. But again, sort of as the decade of the 1860s rolls along, nothing really comes of it. On February 4 of 1860, a revelation sort of comes through this journal, the Architects and Mechanics Journal, which I had talked about before. And they essentially reveal what happened, I think, in the way that everything that I've read, everything I've looked at about what happened here. They say that in this journal that foundries who are disreputable, when people would buy pillars by the weight and not, by the number and not by the weight, foundries would have figured out a way to do this technique called skimming, where they would make the outer rings, when you would look at the outer edges of a pillar, they would be perfectly shaped. They would be the proper thickness. But basically, as you go into the length of one of these pillars, the walls become thinner and thinner and thinner. And basically, they call it skimming. And they basically say they know this happens all the time. And it's very, very difficult to catch it unless you're looking for it. And so they're pretty sure this is what happened. They say there are ways that this could have been prevented. Somebody could have, as some of these came into the city, inspected some of them by drilling holes at intervals. It would have revealed where some of them were faulty, where the walls weren't thick enough in the middle. You could also roll them downhill. And if they were out of round, they wouldn't roll like properly down a hill. And you could figure out and tell that they were no good that way. In fact, in the inquest hearing, somebody talks about how one of the pillars, when it was shipped from this foundry, the Eagle Foundry in Boston, when it was shipped to Lawrence, it fell off the wagon. And when it fell off the wagon, it shattered. And people said, oh, wait, like these are no good. Like something shouldn't, like an iron pillar that's going to hold up a fifth floor of a mill building shouldn't fall off a wagon 3 feet to the ground and break. There's something wrong here. But again, nothing really came of it. And so the Architects and Mechanics Journal is onto something, I think, and they say that by singling out only Bigelow, they let the owners off the hook. And at the same time of letting these owners off the hook in Lawrence, they're essentially also letting off the hook also lots of other manufacturers who are loading up their mill buildings with heavy machinery, are taking risks with worker health and safety, and that the verdict here is that they've essentially given a green light for people to be less careful about these buildings. Ironically, in 1870, finally in the Commonwealth, there's a Bureau of Labor Statistics created, which is supposed to keep track of these accidents and workplace health and safety and injuries and exposures to dust and chemicals and things like that. And the first head of this committee is one of the people that headed up the disaster relief committee for the Pemberton, when they were trying to figure out how to give aid and comfort to the families of people who had either lost a loved one or had somebody in their family who wasn't able to work. And so he ends up now sitting in this really interesting position. But not a lot changes in the Commonwealth. A short while later, in 1874, there's a horrific fire in a mill building in Fall River called the Granite Mill. And this is a woodcut from an article about it. There's a lot of stuff in the Fall River Historical Society documenting this particular collapse. You can see them lowering injured and expired workers from the floors of this building. 1910, just before the Triangle Factory fire, which most of us know about, there's another sweatshop in Newark, New Jersey that catches on fire, killing more than 24 workers. The photo of people trying to put the fire out. Then we get something horrific like the Triangle Fire, and all these things from the Pemberton forward. There are any number of these accidents that sort of raise this question of public health, of worker health and safety. Not much changes through all of this, all of these disasters. We're fortunate to see these photographs that Lewis Hine took, who documented child labor. You can see a picture here where these two young workers are outside a hospital getting their hands fixed. Obviously, they've had severe damage done to fingers. This is in Fall River as well. And again, the idea of guarding machinery doesn't really take place. We get scenes like this of young kids working in coal mines being exposed, and owners, again, not having any liability, not having any consequence to exposing these really young kids to coal dust, to what we know, in the more recent period as black lung disease. And we really don't have in the United States, we don't have a federal health and safety law. We don't have codified health and safety regulations in terms of exposures to toxics and dangerous machinery. We don't have something put into effect until 1972. So again, think about the scope here, right? 1860, this building collapses. The day after it collapses, a diligent legislator tries to get work done to try to figure out a way to begin the process of making sure things like this don't happen again. And we don't get federal legislation. We don't get a US Federal Health and Safety Commission and investigators and things that, set up to prevent these things from happening until 1972. So that's a long time for this sort of suffering on the job to take place. So I'm going to turn this over to my friend Bridget Marshall, and colleague of mine in the English department at UMass Lowell, who actually, unbeknownst to me while I was working on this, was also working on such things from a very different perspective. But they connect really, really well. And so I thought it would be cool to have her sort of weigh in on how these things were thought of in the larger world. And then we'll open it up for some questions and comment. So Bridget, hopefully you're still there. You haven't been bored to tears.
Oh, Bridget, we can see you, but I can't hear you at the moment. Looks like you just have to connect to your audio.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep,
Yes.
there you go.
Yay!
That was my fault for not getting out of the slides.
That's all
As soon as I
right.
got out of the slides, we could hear you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Bob. That was amazing. You have dug up so many amazing sources, and thank you for giving me a few moments to add a little bit. I've been coming at the Pemberton case and many other horrors of industrial labor of the 19th century from the literary side of things. So coming from an English department, this story, you saw, Bob showed a couple of poems that were popular at the time. People definitely wrote, there were many, many poems written about the Pemberton collapse. Some of them were published as broadsides that claimed that the money raised by selling the broadsheets would go towards victims. There's also an amazing short story by Elizabeth Stewart Phelps, who lived in Andover at the time of the collapse, and she wrote the 10th of January, published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1868. So this is years after. It sort of sat with her and she researched it. Just a beautiful story that imagines, it's fiction, but she hews very closely to the real life events, and she's amazing in really focusing in on just one story, an imagined story, but of one individual woman. There's also a ridiculously trashy dime novel that comes out in 1871, Bessie Rayner, The Factory Girl, A Tale of the Lawrence Looms. And it's just over the top, this very cheap, it's cheap, literally on cheap paper, and sold really well. It has a few glancing moments of reality in it, but it dramatizes things. There's a woman's story at the center of it, but there's this bad, evil, gothic villain character who dies in the ruins, and while he's dying, he literally grabs a splinter of a beam and uses his own blood to write a confession on a piece of paper. So sort of really amping up the anxiety and horror and terror of the moment. So the book that I just wrapped up, and thank you, Bob, for helping me promote it, really looks at the ways that fiction and some poetry as well, but fictional representations of industrial labor in the 19th century often borrowed from all kinds of Gothic imagery. There were vampires, right? Mill owners were shown to be these sort of monsters or vampires preying upon usually young female innocent victims, and it sort of sets up what used to be a Gothic maiden in a castle being attacked by some aristocratic villain becomes the mill girl in the factory who's being attacked by not just an individual bad overseer or horrible mill owner, but also kind of the overall horrible conditions of factory life. So, and this is something that we see in transatlantic literature. It's actually British and American literature, poetry and fiction shows all of these sort of Gothic resonances. And so that's what my book's about. Thank you, Bob. And thank you for all those amazing sources that you dug up. It's incredible work that you've done.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Cool. Like again, we're a large university, but not like huge. And there's somebody I know. We live in the same neighborhood, and she's working on this. And I saw the cover of the book and said, "Wait, like you're doing that?" So yeah, whatever. I mean, I think this is a story that's got legs to be told more. I'm trying to think about writing a play, but I don't know, Bridget, if you want to work with me on writing a screenplay.
Let's do it, Bob. Let's do it.
My daughter's out in Hollywood. We can see if she'll find the money for us, and then we can retire.
Doesn't have to dream.
Yeah. Anyway,
Well,
floor is open, I guess, right? Or...
Yeah, absolutely. So folks, please feel free to drop questions in either the Q&A feature or in the chat. Both of them will work, and I will go back and forth between both of those to answer your questions. So we'll give folks a minute here to add anything they have. Looks like we have one here from Josh. Excellent presentation, teaching a course on disasters in Massachusetts. In my research, I have other industry-related disasters during the period are the 1874 Mill River Dam collapse in Williamsburg, and 1905 Grover Shoe Factory collapse in Brockton. You mentioned the 1874 Fall River fire collapse. Can you think of any similar events that may have been driven by builders and company owners?
I think that I know something. I know some about that dam collapse, and I think there definitely is a connection to that one out in Western Mass. I have a friend who wrote a book about that, and that was always suspect that it was built in a hurry. I mean, the wonder is, I think, actually, when I think about this more, the wonder is that more of them didn't fall. Because, and I think there's probably a literature about how they were like that after the Pemberton, that what happened is a lot of places went out and like actually looked again at their buildings and shored them up and did a bunch of re-bricking. And I know in Lowell, right after the Pemberton came down, for several days, workers in Lowell wouldn't go to work. They wouldn't go in any mill buildings in the city. And obviously that set the mill owners over around the bend. that all of a sudden nobody's showing up, right? And eventually they went back to work. But when that happened, it forced the Locks and Canals Company, which was like the equivalent of the Essex Company in Lawrence. It forced the Locks and Canals Company to actually go into and inspect. Now, how good of a job they did, I'm not, it's hard to tell. Who knows, right? But they actually went and at least went through the motions sufficiently that workers felt like it would be okay to go back in again. I also found reference to Huntington Hall in Lowell, which was a major facility with upstairs auditorium, and the train station was under it. At one point, when that was packed with people in the 1850s, it nearly collapsed. Everything shifted and a floor like tilted at some monstrous degree, and people slid, sort of like the Poseidon Adventure or something. People were like, and it didn't fall. And when it happened, people in Lowell recollected and related it to Lawrence and said, probably the same people that built Huntington Hall built the Pemberton Mill. Now, again, I haven't been able to figure out if that's true, but it is really fascinating to sort of look at this. I know reading stuff about England. There were a number of buildings in England that when they were built, they were really rickety, and they actually went to this process of where they actually put iron bands around these buildings, almost like elastics. They put like iron sheeting around some of the buildings that people worried about. And so I found a couple articles about how many tons of iron were used to shore up these buildings. So yeah, I mean, it's really, but there were no safeguards, there were no inspections.
Well, I have a question too, to kind of elaborate on some of the commentary you just made. Did either of you, Robert or Bridget, did you track the mill workers after the collapse to see, did they go back into mill work in another factory in the area? Did they go into something completely different? Like, as you said, never wanted to enter a mill again. I don't know if you've tracked what their lives were like after.
Bridget, you got something?
I sadly don't have anything on that. I would love to. I mean, we have that one, there's the counting of all of the injuries and what was wrong with the various folks, but I don't know, Bob, have you found anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, there is some indication that a lot of people ultimately went back to work. And in some cases, not too long after the building fell, like there were 300 or 400 people that maybe had a scrape or whatever, but were not really injured at all, and eventually started looking for other work. It was just really lucky, again, sort of where you were in the building when it fell. And it looks as though if you were on the top, you made out better, because as it fell, it sort of like tipped over and collapsed. And if you were near the bottom, you were in big trouble. If you were higher up, nothing was necessarily crushing you, and you were able to, a lot of people got saved by crawling under the machinery, because the machinery was so sturdy, and there would be rubble and timber over people, but then they would be rescued. Ultimately, the most people who lost their lives died from fire. They couldn't be rescued in time, and there was a horrible fire like late in the night of the 10th, and people couldn't get out. So a lot of people went back to work. The interesting thing is that immediately after it fell, there started to be all kind of money pouring into Lawrence to take care of the health needs of people who were hurt. And so the Essex Corporation set up a hospital they had a boarding house and they emptied it out and created a hospital and a triage center, and they had nurses and doctors, and people who needed long-term care could live in that little building for quite a while. And so they did that. They collected somewhere in the neighborhood of about $80,000 in donations. And there's really good records in the Lawrence Public Library and the Lawrence History Center where the money came from. Most of the money came from small donations from workers and unions. Very little money came from wealthy Bostonians, which didn't surprise me in the least. But the fact of the matter is, when you go through that list, you don't see like $1,000 from the Lowell family or $5,000 from, you know, the Cabots or whatever it is, the really wealthy Bostonians, right? They're not, they don't show up. But to your point of like going back to work, after a few weeks of collecting the money, the mayor issues an edict: send no more money, food, clothing, medicine to Lawrence. These people are going to get too used to not working for a living, and they'll never go back to work. And so they cut off the money. They cut off the donations. They cut off the collection. And so they dispense the money, and they're pretty careful about keeping records house by house of who gets money. They do a really careful house by house of injuries, right? They go knock on doors and say, was anybody in your family hurt? How badly were they hurt? Can they work? Whatever, if you need groceries. And they did that pretty carefully and kept really good records for a while. But then the mayor and the mill owners got together and said, oh crap, like the work ethic's gonna go away here if we keep giving people stuff. Almost like the COVID relief when people were complaining about people getting extra unemployment, like they'll never go back to work. And so the same thing happened in Lawrence. And by February, they were saying, don't send any more money. Yeah.
Crazy.
So people had to go back to work, or they would, or, I mean, you know, I don't know if anybody's ever done something where like you have all the names, because Bridget's right, there's a really great resource that this person put together of all the deaths, right? And so you can see family names. Now, I don't know if anybody's ever like taken a look at like the 1870 census, for example, to see did people leave, right? Or those, but some of the names, the Irish names especially, are so common that, you know, if you have like a very typical Irish name, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've disappeared. So it'd be kind of hard to do. But yeah, the controversy over the money was the really big deal in the aftermath.
Yeah, very interesting. We did have a few questions come in from Q&A. Diana asked, she said she heard that the collapse was due to looms being situated on the top floors and all sinking at once. I said, thanks for the information. Her question that came out of this was, did the Lowells, besides the sister, ever publicly express remorse for the incident?
Not that I ever saw. It doesn't mean they didn't, but not that I ever saw. And I think they wanted to, since they had built the building and then sold it, they wanted to distance themselves as quickly as possible. So in the immediate aftermath, John Lowell writes a letter which gets published in a lot of newspapers in Boston, where he basically says, hey, I sold the building in 1857. I've got nothing to do with this. And tries to offload it on Nevin and the other person that bought it with him. And then they basically fixate on Charles Bigelow. Bigelow, by the way, is this trained engineer from West Point. And knows his stuff, right? But ends up being saddled with it. And yeah, in 1860, so think of it, 1860, the Civil War is looming. And a lot of mill owners in Lowell as well are doing this, particularly in Lawrence, from reading the newspapers. They're packing the factories with as many pieces of machinery as they can fit. So to the comment of like packing the top floors with heavy machinery, that's why they're moving the machinery on the day that the building collapses, right? Because they're trying to make room for more machines, because more machines means more cloth, means more money. And that's what the Mechanics Journal was worried about, that without like overseeing that, you're giving people carte blanche to just load up these and I mean, I didn't talk about it, but because it's more than could be handled in a talk, but in the 1880s, 1890s, all up into the early 1900s, when there were big like engineers conferences and conventions of engineers and builders and whatnot, this is a topic. Why did the building fall? This is heavily thought about. It becomes the keynote lecture at like the Engineers of the World conference in Budapest, right? I mean, it's amazing how much, but no recriminations back. Yeah.
I had a few more questions that came in. 2 follow-up questions from Diane. By the illustration of the city hall does not match with her recollection. Was it a fanciful rendering, or was there another city hall? And then the other question was, what kind of cloth did the Pemberton produce, and for what market?
So, you got it, Bridget? You got it, or?
No, I think those are great questions.
The Pemberton is making a fancy, from what I understand, I'm making a fancy cloth with a lot of like a calico cloth with all sorts of swirly designs and things. I'm not a good cloth person, so, but for a pretty wide market. I mean, the imagery is artist renderings of, I mean, it's City Hall. The City Hall, the main floor in City Hall gets turned into a morgue, and that's consistent in the poetry and everything that I've ever seen, and the church, St. Mary's, as I said in the beginning, where a lot of the young parishioners end up in the church. And so that's, yeah, I mean, there's no cameras, right, obviously. And so we're lucky that like Frank Leslie's magazine and whatnot, I mean, they have great artists who like show up and are doing like crazy sketches and things. And so we have a really, we have that really good record. So, but yeah, I mean, people loot the site. That's pretty clear in all the newspaper accounts. People are walking away with like, you know, parts of people, and clothing and boots. And I mean, it's just like, it's a scene. It's a mob scene. People are pouring out of the train station in Lawrence and racing to the site, because it's like, nobody's ever seen such a thing. Yeah, it's grim. It's gothic.
Absolutely. Right.
Right? It's gothic.
Yeah. Rose asked, when did Massachusetts enact legislation about the age at which children could work? She said she's a daughter and niece of Pawtucket girls who went to work in 1914, 1918 when they turned 14 years old.
So they start changing laws in Massachusetts actually pretty soon after the Civil War. But you can still work when you're really young, as long as you can show proof of being in school for a certain amount of hours a day. And so, I mean, when I was 14, I had to go to City Hall where I grew up and get a work permit. And I had to get it signed by the principal of the school where I was, that I was actually in attendance and whatever. And then I could take it around to places that might hire me. And so that's what they did. And so in Massachusetts, but it's not, I mean, the thing about Massachusetts is seen as progressive when it comes to thinking about schooling, but it's not really well enforced, right? I mean, there's no enforcement mechanism. And parents are forever, we see this in 1912 in the Bread and Roses strike. There's all this evidence that we see from that parents will actually pay people to falsify birth certificates to make their kids be older than they are so they can work. And so somebody who's 11 or 12 is working in a mill in Lawrence, and it's obvious when you look at that person, they're not 14 or over, but they have a birth certificate signed by the priest of Saint whatever's parish saying that, you know, they were born in whatever 14 from 1912 is. And I mean, we know this because after that strike, kids go to Washington and testify before Congress. And they ask them, like, how are you working? You're so young. And one of them like spills the beans. Oh yeah, somebody showed up and talked to my father about paying him, and he would come back with with fake work papers. It happened all the time. So even though like things look good on paper, in a place like Lawrence where people are desperate for work, if you're in a really big family and you turn 12 or 13 and you have 6 or 7 other siblings coming along the way, and you've got 2 arms and 2 legs, you're going to work. If there's a way to figure out how to do it, and it's not really that well enforced. It's a great question.
I have another good question here. I think there's maybe 2 or 3 questions left here. Cassie, it's a great presentation. I didn't know about the list of injuries. Was there any correlation between that list and the amount of aid they received from the donations?
I can respond just a little on that. I dropped into the into the chat. Google Books has that whole document online, and you can see how much money you got if you died, and also the death, you got a different amount for women versus men, for children versus adults, and you can see what injuries, how much money you'd get for various injuries. So you can take a look at the firsthand examples there.
Yeah, broken legs,
it's pretty
$10,
interesting.
broken arms,
Yeah.
50. And it's very much, when I was looking at that, it reminded me of, like, if people remember after 9/11, when there was all this money that was going to be given out, and they created this ombuds person who was going to figure out how much the families of deceased should get. And they did something very similar. They come up with a logarithm basically to say, well, if you're white and 40 and a lawyer, you're going to make this much money over your lifespan. And if you're black and you're cleaning the building, you're going to make this much money. So white lawyer gets X and black, sweeper gets Y, right? And so it's very similar in the way that it was, that in the men and the women thing is very noticeable. Even in death. Even in death.
They also specified that for some of the families that had deaths or losses or injuries, that they didn't give the money directly to the family, but they gave it to someone trustworthy who could then manage the money for them. There's a lot of really problematic language around who is deserving or worthy or capable of taking care of money and managing it. It comes through very clearly in that report.
Well,
yeah, and some of it's based on if you're Irish, then if we give you this money, you're going to drink. And so there's that stereotype is just really pretty blatant in the way that they're parceling out. If you're German, yeah, we'll give you the money because you're a hard worker. Of course, Germans don't drink, right? So yeah, I mean, it's really yeah, you're right. That document is really quite something to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because hopefully some folks here we'll review that after the fact. I think there's one more question I'm seeing.
Sure.
Deborah asked, could you say more about why they were ramping up production before the Civil War? Were they anticipating a disruption in the supply of cotton?
You got it. Good historian work on your part, whoever asked the question. Right. They're really worried about cutoffs in markets, cutoffs in supplies, cutoffs in customers. Potential problem if they're shipping anything abroad, what might happen depending on if the British might end up supporting the Confederacy, and if the Confederacy might try to blockade shipping lanes, all sorts of things. In Lowell, they do the opposite. In Lowell, they basically try to accumulate all this cotton and then hold it and sell it, and try to make a killing by basically hoping there is a war and there'll be a shortage. And so they sell all their stocks, and then as the war drags on, they're in trouble because they basically are empty. They don't have any cotton, so they basically screwed themselves by trying to be greedy in the beginning. And so they fill up all these cotton warehouses in Lowell in 1859 and 1860, and then offload it at really high prices. But by 1862, they're in big trouble in Lowell. And yeah, and I mean, Lawrence Mills worked through the Civil War. They're able to figure it out to some degree.
I had one other short question, and then I have just one final comment for hope for comments on. Ellen asked, were most mill workers in Pemberton Mills immigrants or Yankee mill girls?
You want that one?
They were mostly immigrants by yeah, by 1860, definitely. And that's probably the case throughout the mills of New England, in fact, by 1860.
Definitely changing. And the mill girls were never dainty. I mean, that's a whole other, that's a talk for another day, but.
Oh, I think he was saying Yankee. I think the question was
did you
Yankee,
say
not
Yankee or
dainty.
dainty?
Yankee.
Yankee.
Okay, sorry. No, I didn't want to, then sorry for casting aspersions. They were not dainty. I thought I heard dainty, but that's because my ears are old.
Okay.
I see there's a question about what was built on the site. They actually rebuilt the Pemberton, a new Pemberton right on the site. Like within a year it was done. It's incredible the turnaround time on that thing.
And they used some of the same bricks from the rubble.
Doesn't inspire confidence, I have to say.
Like who would want to go back to work in there?
No.
There's
So,
also, if you go, just for people that are hanging in there, if you go online and do a search, there's actually a documentary that Louise Sandberg did, who was the librarian at the Lawrence Public Library and ran the community history room. And she and her husband and son did this really cool documentary on the fall of the Pemberton. And you can find it on YouTube. It's about 40 minutes long. You'll see me again as one of the so-called experts. But they actually went to the university and got a bunch of building engineers to comment on like why it might have fell, and they did the simulation of the pillars breaking, and it's really cool. But for anybody that's interested, or also for anybody that might be a teacher, there's a way to use a lot of that in a classroom to sort of. I mean, I did a workshop with engineering students in February and basically talked about the ethics. Like if you see a pillar fall off a wagon and break, why do you keep using those pillars to build a building, right? I mean, I just like pose these ethical questions, like what would you do? And it's really interesting to see them hem and haw. And it's like, oh my God, like I'm not going over any bridges anymore.
Well, I have one final question. Obviously, in light of the recent catastrophe in Florida with the collapse of the condo buildings, obviously we haven't learned our lesson. But do you have any thoughts or anything you'd like to say in regards to that? And as hopefully we, will get better in our engineering and making sure that we're doing more sweeps and more inspections and things like that. But I just wanted to bring that up because obviously that's on folks' minds very recently as we dealt with those catastrophes. And looking back, on history as we talk about this, it's similar thing. It was greed and just lack of public health, public safety, that's causing these things to happen over and over again.
I mean, it's like the story that somebody mentioned earlier of the dam collapsing out in Western Mass. We've so dismantled any kind of infrastructure to check these things out, right? I mean, you can go online and find reports about how many dams around the country are near failure, and hopefully some of the infrastructure money will actually go to like fixing them. And I mean, there was a bridge not too long ago that collapsed in Italy, I recall, like this major bridge that connected through this big gorge in Italy that connected these two towns, and it wasn't even that old, but it failed, right? And so I think that seems to me to be a case where they were supposed to be inspecting and doing something, and people just took shortcuts and didn't do it. I mean, eventually it's going to come out that whoever was supposed to inspect that got got a yacht or something and sailed away. And whoever the Charles Bigelow is in Miami will be blamed for, right? I mean, was like 3 or 4 years ago, there was this big over the highway bridge in Florida that also collapsed at some college, right? That connected over a highway, 2 parts of a campus at some University of Miami or something campus, and people tumbled off of that into the highway. And it was the same thing, and people were, oh yeah, we didn't think that was right when it opened. I know every time I see something like that, I think of like this, and the inquest makes it so obvious that people understood that this was not a safe building. And just sort of went ahead. But also I think it was a signal to the earlier question of who's working in these buildings. It's like that quote at the end of the slides of the young kids working in the coal mine. Well, they're immigrants, they don't speak English. Whatever.
Well, relevant in the 1800s, relevant long before that, and still relevant today.
Yeah, here we are, right? Yeah, I mean,
Here we are.
It's pretty stunning.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully some folks will watch this lecture that that needs to learn this history, and hopefully
Yeah.
we'll make
Send
some
it to all your
progress in the
engineering
future.
friends.
Yes, yeah, we'll have to reach out to some colleges of engineering, right, to send this over.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both so much. Robert, thank you so much for this presentation tonight. It was fantastic. Thank you to the Lawrence History Center for partnering with us. And we, the Public Health Museum, on behalf of us, we thank you for joining us this evening. We hope to see you at one of our next events. And I'm sure the Lawrence History Center, I know they have a fantastic calendar of events that they put on as well. So we hope to see you at some of our future events. And have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good
Thanks,
night, all.
Bridget.
Thank you.
Thank you, Public Health Museum.
Thank you. Bye.